I think it's time for us as people to really actually understand a very, very deep lesson from the Irish Famine. The idea for me that 1 million of our people died here in this land such a short time ago is actually incredible.
I'd like to see people stop calling the famine in the history books. Famine means extreme scarcity of food. Ireland at the time was known as the Garden of England. There was lots of food here being shipped out all the time. We need to start calling it something different, you know.
That time in Ireland of great deprivation, there was a few that had great wealth.
Perhaps the event which is most harrowing of all the events of the famine is the story told by James Berry of the tragedy at Doolough in the spring of 1849. The potato having failed, 600 starving people made their way into the town of Louisburg in search of food or a ticket of admission to the workhouse. The relieving officer said he had no power to grant them either food or ticket, but told them that they should apply to a Board of Guardians meeting which would be held next day in Delphi Lodge, some 10 miles distant. The unfortunate people had no homes to return to. They were in rags, almost naked and without food for several days. They sat down in front of the houses in Louisburg during the night, and many of them were found dead there the next morning. 400 of those who remained trudged through mud and rain along a goat track in the direction of Delphi Lodge. They had to cross the Glengreen River, which was in full flood, and a deeper and more dangerous stream before reaching Delphi. Wet and cold, they reached Delphi Lodge, where the vice guardians were at lunch and could not be disturbed. The people sat down in the damp among the pine trees. When the guardians had finished their meal, they condescended to see the huddled mass of people, but refused them relief or tickets. Their hazardous journey had been in vain. Darkness was gathering in the sky when they started on the weary journey back through a wild mountainous country. They forded a river, colder now on account of the night. A strong northwest wind blew up, carrying with it showers and piercing hailstones. When they reached that terrible spot called the Strapabuie on the brow of the cliff overhanging the lake at Doolough, the heavy squall swept them by the score into the lake. Some managed to crawl along and reach the bank of the Glengreen River, where, fatigued by the hardship of the journey, they died. The relieving officer at Louisburg took a group of men along the corpse-strewn path. They had buried many of the people where they fell. Where there was no earth to bury them, they brought them into a little valley and buried them there.
It has become a very significant date and a very significant event in the calendar, and really it's about honouring people who are forgotten, who died in tragic circumstances and who for many years were never remembered. Remembering is a sacred thing, it's a revolutionary thing, and remembering can and does bring about change, and change for a more just and equitable society.
I've actually never done the famine walk before, in fact, and I've thought an awful lot about it since Joe asked me to do this a few months ago, and I've been wondering why I felt so emotional about it. I guess, like, here I am and I have to do this now. And I'm really glad that Afri started to do a famine walk, because just once a year we get to really commemorate what actually happened. There had been no commemoration of the Irish famine at the 100th anniversary because it was still too recent for the people to actually really remember it. Now, the last few years, I've become very involved with the seed sovereignty movement in Ireland and in Africa particularly. And it's really interesting for me going to countries that are now facing famine. And they desperately, desperately want to hold on to their own seeds. And they call them, interestingly, women's seeds, the forgotten seeds, and orphan crops. What's interesting to me about the famine is that it actually wasn't really a famine. Already, the situation had been created so that the people no longer had their land. They weren't allowed to sow all of the crops that would have been indigenous to this area and to this part of the world. They had lost their control over the agrobiodiversity that would have allowed them to survive. So it's not just actually about the potato, it's about the fact that they were only allowed to grow predominantly one type of potato, the lumper potato. When the Peruvians who had actually brought the potato here from South America would have been growing out of a community resource of about 2,000 varieties of potato, 200 varieties per field, because if a blight struck, they'd have something to fall back on. And this is really, really a salutary lesson for the world. We desperately need to keep all of the rich diversity growing in the ground, out in the fields. I think of the loss of that incredibly complex, rich peasant society in Ireland. All that whole layer of richness of our country, of our people that we lost. Because they're the people that I meet in Ethiopia and Kenya now who are keeping their rich, complex, informal systems of seed alive in the ground, in situ, evolving and adapting in the climate and in the environment. And all of the dominant paradigm that would have been the reason why there was a famine in Ireland in the 1840s, they're all there in these countries trying to steal their genetic resources and trying to capture their seeds and trying to tell them to grow it a particular way, like the white man says. So it's the very same thing. What can we do? Only walk and remember and continue going forward, because on the darkest days, we just always need our friends to stand in solidarity with us. And that's the heart and the spirit of the Irish people, and that's what we want to continue.
Separated from my children, confined to the island, I died and was buried on this sacred new land.
I think a lot of people remembered in here, they gave their lives because of the famine. I think 1916 wouldn't have happened without the famine. The Choctaw people and the Irish people, the ruling classes dehumanised them, and that's how they were able to do the things they done to them, you know.
There's no doubt whatsoever that the memory of the Great Famine did feed into the rise of nationalist opinion in Ireland in the late 19th century. I think it was particularly potent too in Irish American nationalist politics. Migrants to the United States were there through a process of emigration to escape poverty. Irish American nationalist groups particularly drew upon the famine to fuel anti-British settlement, nationalist sentiment, and then Republican sentiment leading into the independence.
I look to the east, I look to the west, to the north and the south, and I'm not too impressed. Time after time after crime, they raped, robbed, pillaged, enslaved and murdered. Jesus Christ was their God, and they done it in His name, so He could take the blame if it's not all a game. With Bible in one hand and a sword in the other, they came to purify my land with their own ancient customs, laws, music, art, way of life and culture, tribal and structure. We had a civilization when they were still Neanderthal nations, and we suffer with the Native American, the Indian in Asia, Aboriginal Australia, the African people with their history so deep, and our children still weep and our lives are still cheap.
You'll never kill our will to be free, to be free. You'll never kill our will to be free, to be free.
We're here today to remember the famine. The cemetery was only opened about 12 years when the famine struck Ireland. The famine became so rampant that a famine burial ground was opened on the southwest corner. That rapidly filled up, and the committee moved up to this, and this part of the cemetery hadn't been developed at the time, it was just green fields. All of this area is buried on. There are tens of thousands of people who died of hunger, who died of disease, who died of the effects of malnutrition and debilitation, buried in the cemetery. The famine officially ended in 1847. Our records will tell you something very different to that. We would estimate about 1852, 1853. Dublin was a tiny little city, 150,000 people. The poor and the starving and the dispossessed of Ireland gravitated towards Dublin in search of shelter, in search of food, or in search of emigration. And they died by the tens of thousands on the Western Road coming in the fever sheds. The only other burial grounds in Dublin were Bully's Acre, North Dublin Union and the South Dublin Union, and they rapidly filled up. Our highest year was 12,000 poor ground burials in this cemetery in 1844, and it continued at that level to a very high degree.
We recall the connection with the Choctaw people in America, who despite their own suffering and trail of tears, reached across the ocean to assist the victims of our great famine, or our great starvation, as we are beginning to call it. There is a plaque on Dublin's Mansion House that honours the Choctaw people and their contribution to the famine, which reads, "Their humanity calls us to remember the millions of human beings throughout our world today who die of hunger and hunger-related illnesses in a world of plenty. Without food, without voice, and without name." Remembering not only allows us to retell past events, but mourn the loss of what could have been, and to commit ourselves to bringing about a world where such atrocities never happen again. As the Irish famine was the great shame and indignity of its time, today we cannot but think of those caught up in conflict and war. The indignity and shame of our day is that the number of displaced people in our world has surpassed 60 million, the highest number since World War II. The lack of action on the part of the international community has meant that just half of identified humanitarian needs are not being met. It has unacceptable consequences. Cutbacks in food rations, families leaving their lands and their homes, crowded camps in Calais, children being deprived of education, girls forced into early marriages, and people compelled to use destructive coping strategies. So today we remember those famine victims buried all over the country, and many here in Glasnevin. And we call on our leaders to be braver, to be more courageous, and to do what is right for refugees, for the hungry, and those who are victims of conflict and war.
Gartha, Jerter ar nain sa net ganulachar fakul, na conraha dam rehista ar golinyaha gan teger, kratahan ag umpur na maru ar chrochar don emod is edrama, agus nielan chire hani an yeri, a sculpture an ton fi wali na slosity is fi fraku yerin na groche. Go blubban na nis tren schrav mar ila vol na wakkel a koru an ye. Go spoeken na nis mar stange an akra kur asnaha na shin shanaka ya kalu fado. Tam hen am hasu vruach ua a mener na shan bajirin parcha a chor la hanam an akil a deg harsham a veil. Tassa a gunya elle ag chenjal wayan a fakkel go major gro gilagad law. Chim elletram elle tacht an bala anyas, tren dost is tre smuch an til anabui. Yadig bre na maruakal elle go balav chon a gorhe. focail beidir mar she tarishe agus jarv vreher.
My granny's granny was born in the 1850s, so people think it's a million years ago, but it's a drop in the ocean. These people had lives and loves and hopes for their children, and you know, they had to die painful, slow, horrific deaths. That's an open wound on the Irish psyche, I think. We don't talk about it. I think we should have a national day of grieving where we all go down to a riverbank or the sea or a lake and just grieve.
I would say it's probably the biggest famine burial ground in the country, bar none.
So we've a number of registers here. The first one for the west side area, which was the area of poor ground that was used, dates between 1839 and 1847.
You cannot often bear of foot, who walked 10 miles at 7 years. You took your little sister's hand and walked her to the poor house door. And when they had but room for one, you left your little sister in, and faint with hunger all day long, you walked the 10 miles back again.
Hello, we're here today at the Hill of Lloyd, about a mile outside the town of Kells in County Meath. We're standing here in what is the old graveyard. There are hundreds of people buried here. We don't know exactly how many. A number of workhouses, of course, were built around Ireland before, during and after the Great Famine. All told, there was about 1,200 people accommodated in the workhouses, which was about twice the original capacity. The dead were able to be removed from the workhouse, which was on the edge of the town, brought through fields, through a series of lanes, up here to the Hill of Lloyd, thus avoiding the streets of the town. In 1991, Afri, Action from Ireland, decided to have a famine walk from the village of Mulla in County Cavan, 10 miles north of here, through the back roads, through the town of Kells, passing the site of the old workhouse, passing the site of the old fever hospital, finishing here at Lloyd. That walk was conducted for 5 years. In the very first year, we had Brian Keenan, who had just recently been released as a hostage from Beirut. He gave a speech here at the closing ceremony in which he uttered the memorable phrase, "Famine is a lie," encapsulated and preserved for posterity on the rear of this stone here. On every walk, there was always a policy of having a speaker from the developing world along to give the perspective and to make the connection with issues of hunger, poverty, starvation and famine in the developing world today. Certainly the famine graveyards were very numerous around Ireland. You can take it for guarantee that every workhouse, and there are over 130 of those around Ireland, would have its own graveyard, either on the site or nearby. Now, as well as those, there are other prominent sites. There are auxiliary workhouses, for example, fever hospitals, which sometimes had their own little graveyards. But also there are other places in remote fields which had their own little famine graveyards. So there are really any number of famine graveyards throughout Ireland. A very big proportion of the Irish population in the poorer classes were totally dependent on the lump of potato because it could be grown in such large numbers, was so nutritious. By 1845, a big proportion of the population, I'd say 1.5 million, 1.5 million, that was their main diet. And when the potato blight struck, that was it. They didn't have an immediate fallback because they weren't growing their own crops. A lot of the crops that were grown were being consumed by people who could afford them or being exported. The potato blight could be described as the crisis which acted as the catalyst for the famine. But the second element you need in any famine, whether it's then or whether it's in the developing world today, is a vulnerable population. And you certainly had that here in Ireland, where there were several million people almost totally dependent on the potato crop, living on poor, marginalised land, very prone to disease and hunger, so that when the blight struck, they were left extremely vulnerable. That said, the lack of an adequate response by the British administration no doubt greatly aggravated and increased the number of people who died during the famine to numbers so large that you could say without any hesitancy of contradiction that that large number of people didn't need to die.
From the western shore to the eastern coast, some turned into presidents, some turned into ghosts. Farewell to that coastline is my home, and I leave it all behind, gotta go it alone. 1845, trying to stay alive. These dirty grey streets I'd gladly swap for my mountainside. My family is gone now, these vicious waves I ride.
So working with Afri, it's important to run groups where people can come together and talk about what's happened or their experience of what they feel happened to Ireland as a nation during the famine. We run groups in rural areas where people get together and they allow themselves to talk and to have space to talk about what their emotions are in relation to it. And this is really important for the healing. It's really important to allow us as a nation to talk about it, to heal, to move forward, to integrate what happened, and to allow ourselves to deal with the events of our past. An important element of integrating the famine and what has happened is to rethink and reframe how we talk about it and how we think about it. A part of this is that we increase our awareness around it, particularly in relation to Irish history and what's taught in Irish schools. An American senator called Tom Hayden said in 1997 in an introduction to a series of lectures on the Great Hunger, he suggested that there was a moral and a spiritual need to remember what had happened, and his quote is, "A famine repressed breeds an insipid hunger of its own, a hunger to know, to grieve, to hold accountable, to resolve and to honour."
Tá seo fíorthabhairt a dúin Marghini sa tír seo, go dóran muid aitheantas don achtar seo inar cúdstaige, mar go thug se brón agus tráma dúin a bhfuil linn go fáil, agus sin mar a chudaíonn na siúladí seo a agraíonn Afri linn. Tá an seans dúin aitheantas a thuirtan ar cúdstaige agus léas a thuirt dúin ar an tráma seo.
Anyway, we'll call it famine for today because the posters have been made, so we'll just leave it, sorry.